torture and mass killings. And we see these in like concentration camps essentially, and then here these soldiers are taking this man to execute him. And the most people that were targeted were political opposition and religious and ethnic minorities because they were believed to have the most threat to the Khmer Rouge. However, eventually in 1979, the Khmer Rouge would lose their power because they were overthrown by Vietnamese forces invading the countrysides. And years down the road, Cambodia eventually became a democracy. So this kind of brings us into the idea of transitional justice. And transitional justice happens after corrupted political regimes and mass atrocity crimes end, and states create their own new governments, predominantly democracies. And these new governments start to question how to deal with the crimes of the past and whether they should establish accountability or just kind of let things fall to the wayside. And often they kind of start these negotiations to figure out how to address the crimes such as torture, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And typically these negotiations are between the domestic leaders and sometimes involve the international community such as the UN or the United Nations Security Council. And through these series of negotiations, they can take months, years, and can happen directly after the new regime takes place or 20 years after these crimes have occurred, which has happened in the case of Cambodia. So through these series of negotiations, states typically decide between 3 different mechanisms: amnesty, truth commissions, and trials. I don't have time to go into great detail right now, so if you guys have any questions later, I can address those. And each of these 3 mechanisms kind of create their own forms and their own formats, and they each have their own sets of pros and cons. And then this brings us to my research questions. Throughout this year-long process, I raised 2 questions. What type of mechanism should be favored by states, and what are most effective after these mass atrocities? And then as a religious studies major, I had this question of religion. What role should religion play when establishing these transitional justice mechanisms, if any at all? And these 2 questions kind of came because I believe that these crimes need to be addressed in order for states to move on and create peace between society and trust between government and society as a whole. And then the question of religion came into play because I believe that our religious traditions and beliefs shape our ideals of what we believe justice is and our expectations of justice. And this is seen throughout all dominant religions. So what I found was that most of the literature showed that states are typically focusing on only establishing one transitional justice mechanism, whether it's amnesty, truth commission, or a court or trial setting. And this kind of only allows for one form of justice to take place, retributive or restorative. And in this context, I'm saying restorative equals reconciliation, which isn't always true, but in this case it is. So, and this happens because states are mostly concerned with their own image in the international community and reestablishing their legitimacy within that society. However, this can be called problematic because victims aren't getting their needs and wants met. So the issue is because only the people that are part of negotiations are political leaders, both domestic and international. So, and if we're honest about politicians, they're usually out of touch with what society wants as a whole. And we even see that in the United States today with our political culture. So, and then in the case of mass atrocities, victims often have a multitude of needs. They want to see perpetrators punished, and they want society to be restored, and they have economic problems as well. And then what I found also was that religious/cultural leaders within the community have a better understanding of what's going on in society because they're interacting with them on the daily. And with that, they are often creating their own unofficial institutions to address these crimes, which kind of can create issues down the road and for future generations. So this brings us to the ECCC, which was formed through negotiations between the United Nations Security Council and Cambodian national government leaders, predominantly their prime minister, in the late 1990s. It was created, these negotiations established a hybrid court that allows for domestic and international administrators, judges, and lawyers work together to establish retributive justice. The primary aim was to find who was most responsible for the crimes during the 1970s. And most of the perpetrators, or the accused that are being tried, are mid and high-ranking officials that were a part of the Khmer Rouge, such as Comrade Duke, which is an interesting case study, but we can talk about that later. And so while the goal of punishing these who are accused and guilty may seem most positive in our Western eyes, it didn't really have the complete support of Cambodian citizens. And through my research, I found that Cambodian nationals and victims were more favorable towards the idea of reconciliation and restoring what society was before. And this comes about because of the Buddhist culture that's ingrained into society. So Cambodia is 95% Buddhist, and it's also declared a Buddhist state within their constitution. So these Buddhist precepts and ideals kind of are weaved into culture in general. And like in the Buddhist culture of Cambodia, it is believed that retributive justice creates an unnecessary amount of harm on the individual, which is one of the main precepts within their religious texts and community in Cambodia. But these needs were never addressed during negotiations because they didn't, the international community nor their prime minister really cared to see what they wanted at the time, nor were religious leaders even a part of the negotiation process, which kind of starts to get to my point of my idea is that maybe community leaders and religious leaders need to be a part of the dialogue when forming these institutions. So I'm going to kind of briefly go over the layout of the ECCC because I think it's a really effective model. So you have international and domestic actors working together, establishing retribution, but you also have this idea of a victim support section, also referred to as the victims unit. So while the UN and Cambodian officials established a court that focused only on retributive justice, there was pressure from religious organizations and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, to provide something more for victims. And through this pressure, the victims unit was created. And the role of victims unit is to provide a resource for victims to come share their story, share what happens, and kind of get closure on what took place. And it is also responsible for creating outreach to the surrounding communities to make sure that everyone kind of knows that the court is there. And I recently found out that 50% of the nation knows about the ECCC, which is a really high percentage when you compare to other international courts that are dealing with these crimes. And another role is that the victims unit is providing for victims' needs such as economical needs, like therapy, physical therapy, mental health therapy, and such like that. So you're actually getting victims involved in the court process, which is a really awesome thing in my perspective. So overall, in my paper, I make 2 suggestions to policymakers that they probably never read. But so I discovered that political and religious actors are working separately, which can cause some divide between the state and citizens in general. And in the case of the ECCC and the victims unit, kind of shows us why political and religious actors can work together and create something that's really, really awesome and involve victims in the process of transitional justice, thus meeting the needs of retribution and reconciliation all at the same time, which is really a cool thing. So my overall policy suggestion is that when it comes to the formation of transitional justice mechanisms, political leaders should include religious and cultural leaders in the formation process. By including these religious and cultural leaders in the conversation, victims will have an advocate fighting for their needs. Also, states should favor a hybrid court because it allows for the domestic system to be built up and gain legitimacy within the state as a whole and the international community, which is really important, which I didn't really touch on during this presentation, but that's okay. So lastly, I just want to say thank you guys for coming and having an interest in this topic. And I really want to thank Dr. Carrie Booth-Walling, Dr. Jocelyn McWhorter, and Dr. Peter Valdina for being part of my committee and helping me through this project. It's been a really good year, and I really had a pleasure working with you guys. And yeah, let's go to some hard-hitting questions. Yes?
Hi, great job. I have a question about the implementation of these kinds of restorative justice programs, particularly in this context. So, excuse me, oftentimes these programs revolve around bringing victims and offenders together, and it sort of sounded like for this victim services agency that the victims were not necessarily reconciling with the offenders, that they're working through some kind of other support staff. Are those folks ever in the same room together? Or?
So there's 2 parts. Victims can either participate actively in the trials, and then during that time they confront their perpetrator, and they're asked more direct questions, which can cause traumatization, which can cause another problem as a whole. And the case that I looked at was Comrade Doik's case, and like one of his like primary victims was able to say something to him after his apology. Whether we know if that's like a real apology or not is kind of up to interpretation. So there are interactions between perpetrators and victims. It's kind of up to the victim. Dr. Brandon.
What inspired this research project?
So last spring, Dr. Walling took a group of us to U of M for a policy talk, and it was on the ECCC in Cambodia, so that kind of sparked my interest. And then in the fall, Dr. Walling was telling me about her trip to The Hague, which is where the ICC is at, and meeting with scholars that were talking about like the role of religion and the change of religion in the Deutsch case, because he converted to Christianity, which kind of raised some red flags in the Buddhist context. Yes?
I'm interested in different countries that are following different pathways. So in South Africa, it was the Truth Commission.
Mm-hmm.
How would you explain the difference between the approach in Cambodia and South Africa?
Yeah, so South Africa was a Truth Commission and Reconciliation Commission, so it was all more about sharing the victims' stories. And in this case, the perpetrators were never really brought to trial because they were given amnesties, so they were kind of like, oh, it's okay. It's not like okay, but like come share your story and you won't get punished, essentially. So like they're creating a shared narrative. And in the case of the ECCC, they're doing a shared narrative through the victims unit in the court while also punishing the perpetrators, if that answers your question.
So I'm wondering why.
Why?
Why Cambodia?
Yeah.
Is it more? Did they each do the appropriate thing, and what's different between those countries?
Well, the idea of appropriate is kind of a topic because it kind of gets into opinions. Like honestly, I think trials are often the best case scenario because it kind of creates more of a deterrence and more of a fear in like future perpetrators. In the case of the ECCC, the reason that they went more for trials is because of the involvement of the UN, and the UN was really pushing Cambodia to create a trial. And in South Africa, it was more for the culture, and it was more domestically like grained. If I have a full understanding of the South Africa Truth Commission.
Thank you, Candace.